Hello, everyone. This is the Free American Press with your host, Alexander Horat. And today we're having a very special guest on the show, and his name is Alex as well. And he's actually a researcher, and he's been researching many things in the economy that is going on, both domestically and internationally. And we're just happy to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you again, and thank you again for inviting me. Since we were on the Morgan Millennial before, so it's a pleasure to
Yeah,
be on
yeah.
again.
Oh, well, we really appreciate you coming back on. And yeah, could you just give us an update on the state of the economy and where you think the economy is going in the USA specifically, and how you think people could prepare for the coming years?
Yeah, of course I would, because this has been important, and ever since our last video, and I said like, yeah, respect massive inflation in like four months or so. Like on the images that I sent you, which involves the like LIBOR future rates, you can see like when we had the interview in June, like 4 months afterwards, we had a massive drop in the like future inflation rates, and all the hype about like, oh, we're going to like hyperinflation, or we're going to have double digit inflation, like same persistent throughout the CPI. Yeah, like that did not happen at all. So I was right on that call. It's just that people, when they look at that video, assume that I would eventually say that, hey, if we would go negative, but I did not mention that. I said that we're having deflation, and if you go from a massive increase of inflation and multiply, and they have like that being massively contracted, then that rate of change throughout that means that it is negative, because you're going from like two, three, four, five, six, seven to now like like six, seven, and five, which overall shows that you did have mass inflation. Now,
Right.
on the overall
True.
economy itself, I do say that we still have more downside to come in the market, both domestic and abroad. And the reason why is because if you look at Jerome Powell's most favorite metric for looking at inflation, it is the near term forward spread, which, if I were to show you through both Bloomberg, then you can see exactly what I am referring to. Here we go. Yep. This is back in 2022, where it is his most favorite metric. And if you also look at this one, if I could share my screen,
Sounds good.
it should be right there. Yep, I see the button on the neutral forward spread, which this is from Economist. You can see the moving average as well. You see that we had a consolidation for several months here, and then we then had a massive drop in November onwards. And the last time you had that rate drop was back in like before the COVID crash, back in 2019. Then you
Right.
had one back in 2000, like 2006, going to 2008 crash, and then you had the entire .com and all like the 80s and the 70s as well, with like Arthur
Yeah.
Burns right here. So yeah, based on both the Fed's favorite economic model and with what we've seen so far, you can see why I'm saying that yes, we have more downside to come in the U.S. markets.
So, what does that mean for Americans?
So for Americans, that means that because we had a massive increase of credit card usage, like loans and several others, especially with the used car market as one of the main primary sources of concern for both banks who have massive loans booked to it, with a certain car company which starts with a C that might liquidate their autos onto the market in bulk soon.
Wow.
And you have BlackRock's like real estate fund and several others, which halted their gates of withdrawals, which means that if you don't have a massive cut in rates in late Q1, Q2, then we will see private markets mark their assets to the actual market, when their entire reason why they can have higher valuations is because they market to the model of the people who create the fund, which means it's higher on average compared to public markets. And if you devalue those, which you have pension funds like CalPERS, which is the California Teachers Pension Fund, and several others who are heavily levered into those markets to get their yield to the average teacher, state, and everything. You can see a massive amount of deflation that can be worse than 2008 crisis.
So you think we're going to see a lot of the housing market go down, used car market go down in prices, kind of those type of things? What do you think of food and other things like that?
That's the funny part, because the thing is, we would actually have biflation, where you have like deflation in asset prices, but inflation in real goods. Because what the Fed is doing now is that they are addressing like demand side inflation, where if you want to get a credit card, your like ARP, the amount of interest rate that you have on a credit card goes up with inflation, like increasing interest rates, and thus if you have shrinking supply of food and other like natural resources like metals, then that's a supply side inflation, where the amount of goods that you want to get decrease, and if you have the same exact demand, then the price of those goods increase. And as I can show you through the times and several others, you can see that it is a lot different from what people can imagine. Here we go. I think this is from CNN. Yes, CNN, and it's a as they say, an historic food crisis at the beginning of this year. Which, if you've been listening to those who've been talking in the commentary, you can see exactly why. Especially since you had the UN food director saying that it's like it is a massive issue, and it is, again, quote unquote, the highest food price on record because of nitrogen fertilizer, and like they can't get their basic fertilizer to create what we know as modern like mass industrial like farming. But
So there's a food crisis in Ukraine right now.
it's not a food crisis in Ukraine. It's a food crisis globally. Okay.
Hmm.
And that is because of you had Russia and China cut off the basic nitrate export in 2019, like September, November 2019. Not 2019, sorry, correction. 2021. And that brought into a food crisis that was going to happen in 2022, which kicked off with the planting season in winter, like February, March, when we had that Ukraine war crisis. And that led to multiple like farmers and others having to raise up their like food, like corn and like cattle prices, which is why you saw lumber did a massive like spike and like back down because of all the supply chain issues that came about it. And because of what happened last year with BASF, which is a German chemical fertilizer plant, which takes natural gas from Russia and uses it to create fertilizer that they export to Brazil, US, and several others, they're permanently cutting off costs, aka impairing their operations to create fertilizer. Because they cannot get the natural gas because you have the pipelines from Nord Stream 1 and 2 blow up, which
Right.
is massive. And this also ties into the crop report you had from the USDA, where it is about the drought that we have. And it is right here, where you have domestic corn supply from the US like at like record drought levels, which you can see through the harvest rate, which goes back to like almost to the lows of 2008. Like the corn futures itself creating a new like higher base level in the entire like UN food like index, like is at like 2008 levels, and yet no one seems to be looking massively at this right now.
So
And the reason why,
could this start some sort of like famine in the United States, or like what are the effects of this happening? Just higher food costs?
it is higher food costs because if you look at what is happening in Pakistan, where they are a not able to have any electricity to power their houses or residential estates, and B, they don't have enough food to where they're having famines, and the UN's even recognizing it. It is because Europe is taking those resources because there's less supply and paying a higher cost for it. And since the US is a mass producer of corn, soybeans, and others, the US wants to maintain that share, even though China has a massive amount of contract for corn, soybeans, and others since last year, coming into like 2022. That means that the overall price level that we have at the store has been increased and will continue to increase until supplies for fertilizer and others get fixed. But since you have tensions in like Europe and Russia, and they are not getting like fixed anytime soon, that means that the cheap natural gas that is used to create fertilizer in Germany, which is the major manufacturer hub of fertilizer, that takes at least a decade to start back up in another place like China or the US, which means the structural inflation of basic food like grains and others has been with us forever, for like 10 years. And that impacts our generation since we're going to be dealing with that when every single like extra dollar that we have increases the amount of wealth that we can have in the future. And thus it is the prime opportunity for us to take advantage of this, since everyone that talks about stuff like, oh, like the Fed's going to decrease, like cut rates, and yes, they will cut rates, which might temporarily decrease supply. That will only stay temporary until you have the Fed like easing and like creating massive amount of stimulus, which goes to the federal government. And the reason why we have a rally in the market now is because they expect China to come out and massively buy commodities like corn, soybeans, metals, and others like they had before, because they have a massive amount of savings for 3 years. But I doubt the validity of that case because of other economic data coming out of China, which it'll take too long for us to talk about.
So if the Fed starts cutting rates, will that have some bad consequences? Because
So the thing is, yes, it will be bad consequences because the Fed is very, very firm on not cutting rates. And if you want to cut rates, that means that the fundamental plumbing of the economy has been massively impaired. Look back to early like 2022, where the Bank of England had to stop quantitative tightening, which is them like them buying bonds from the market to then sell those like treasuries into the market, and to just prevent their pension funds from going bust. Because that is the level of impairment that we're talking about. Or when Credit Suisse was about to go under after that. That is the level of, oh my God, like the entire financial system could collapse. That is what the Fed has to stop is doing, what it's doing, cut rates to prevent that from happening. And that itself, when you're in that crisis, is not good for stocks, not good for bonds or anything else. It's just a matter of trying to get dollars, because everyone has dollars being the main unit of currency, which is used to trade metals, gas, and food, on top of all the loans that they have against their own economy. And thus, when there's a bad scramble for one currency, you can see what happens here.
Yeah, so what will happen if the Fed keeps increasing rates instead?
So what happens for people in the US? It will allow the inflation that they're experiencing or could experience to be pushed onto the emerging markets or those who hold the currency, like currency outside the US. And they are the ones that had to deal with inflation, which we see through like New Zealand and Europe, where like Christine Lagarde came out like several weeks ago saying like, oh, we won't raise rates. And then came to Davos earlier this week and say, okay, so inflation has been higher than what we expected, which that's an oxymoron, because if inflation is higher than expected, they need to raise rates, but you can't raise rates. They need to make the perception that you will raise rates. And if you don't follow through with it, then your currency and your treasury bonds collapses. And that's not what Europe wants right now. Because if you look at the Cambridge article about BRICS trying to de-dollarize, let me pull it up. You see that, where is it? Right here. You see that Russia is actually decreasing its dollar holdings and increasing its euro holdings. Now, this could change because of 2022 and the war that we experienced, where the U.S. Treasury seized its reserves, and same with euro, which means that they might be moving more towards the Shanghai Futures Exchange and the amount of gold that they have. Right here. Then that's 2020 gold, because like before that was a lot of gold. So yeah, like it all depends. Like, and again, all this is like a moving target, but people, like, especially those who are younger, like us, they don't usually look at this stuff because this is so much in the weeds and there's so many variables. And yet, it's a lot simpler once you take a step back and understand that Jerome Powell is fighting like demand side issue. He's using demand side tools to suppress it, to fight supply side issues and confidence issues of the actual currency itself. And if you understand that, then you understand how bad of a bind he is and how much that all that we see now with inflation will be persistent. But short term, we could have a massive bust.
So you think that the Federal Reserve is actually going to be cutting rates instead of increasing them? Is that kind of your consensus?
I believe that they have room for a few more hikes, but eventually they have to cut.
And when they start cutting, that will create the runaway inflation, right?
It has a potential to do so. The reason why it has potential is because it depends upon what happens out of the White House. Since the White House itself is the one that created a massive runaway from Saudi Arabia and others from holding the dollar, which is why you have them coming out at Davos. And you can see the Bloomberg article here about, where is it? Where's that article? Right here. Here it is. Where Saudi Arabia, it says it's opening about selling its oil trade with other currencies, which is massive, massive news. And this came out like a little bit over a week ago at Davos. And the thing is, if you actually look at the interview with Mohammed, they act like it's very, very casual, like saying, "Oh yeah, it's fine. Like we could just like not use the dollar. It's like totally fine. Like don't worry about it. Like yeah, it's happening." And this ties in with like the head of China using the Enbridge currency, like CBD system, to transact most of the Southeast Asian currencies with China and Saudi Arabia, previously talking with South Africa to join the BRICS system, which they are trying to create a central bank digital currency where it is all tied to commodities, which gold is one of them, which is why you have Sergei Glaziev, which is one of the chief financial heads of Russia, saying that they are trying to create the gold ruble 3.0 and trying to have all their stuff backed with gold and trying to de-dollarize, which is massive news, legitimately massive news.
So if a country like Saudi Arabia does this, do you think that could cause a war between the United States and them, or what do you think would happen? And if they do that, and if other countries start following that, what do you think they'll do to oil prices in relation to the U.S. dollar?
The thing is, the U.S. still produces oil, which is light sweet crude. However, most refineries in the U.S. are tuned to heavy sour crude, which comes out of Three main places: Venezuela, like Saudi Arabia, and Russia. Russia is the main primary producer of heavy sour crude, and thus the oil price cap that Janet Yellen has proposed and is being implemented with a double oil price cap means that the U.S. will be restricted from buying heavy sour crude. Now, I know all the oil bulls and arguments are saying that, hey, we actually have Canadians like heavy sour crude that could come to the U.S. But the key issue is that you have the pipeline that Joe Biden cut off at the start of his administration, like the Keystone XL pipeline, which was supposed to get those heavy sour crude down to Texas, so it could be refined to then be used in the U.S. market to cut America off of Russian heavy sour crude. And I don't see that happening, especially with this administration where they do not want to do so. So our influence of the U.S. of the entire world market of oil will be decreasing, especially when we antagonize the main cartel, which is OPEC, from actually being cooperative with us. And then from there, you have the most ridiculous arguments from the White House saying, oh, we should block all oil exports, which our own refiners are not tuned to, which means that you're basically having oil that you cannot use, or it takes 3 to 5 years for refiners to then change its blend so it can use that oil. And by the time you have those 3 to 5 years, where's your supply to do so? Oh wait, Biden withdrew it all through the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So you can't have that timeline. So you're stuck. And thus, you can see if that's the U.S. domestic part, then you can see why it should factor in Saudi Arabians or others, then signing saying, hey, let's cut the U.S. off, like we did back in the 70s. Remember that? Where people had to line up with odd and even plates to get oil and fill up their cars. Yeah, we can see that again.
So why are they setting us up for failure then, the Biden administration, and for instance that pipeline from Canada and among other things? Why do you think they're potentially setting us up for failure here in the United States with our oil reserves? Is that so we move to their new Green Deal and all get electric cars, or what's with this whole thing that they're doing?
There's many ways to try to make an explanation of this. And the most rational one that I've seen so far is that they do not work for the US. It's that's the most simplest answer I can see so far. Since we do know that Mitch McConnell's fiance has heavy ties to the CCP. It's just a known fact. Same with Nancy Pelosi, where she has massive ties and lobbying efforts from China and other nations. And it is also a fact that every single Biden, Pelosi, and Mitch McConnell all have ties to Ukraine. It is a known fact, and it's a public record of fact. And if you tie that all together, they can see why they'd be working for foreign powers, since if you have mass blackmail on them to where they'll be ousted from society unless they can cooperate with you, and you pay them for them to ignore the issues that you want to ignore, like taking out a pipeline, or when you have Russia supporting green movements in Germany, so it can make the entire German government be dependent upon Russia and abide by Russian policies. And you don't think that you don't have similar issues happening in the U.S., even if it's not Russia or might be China or Europe? You don't think that this is not happening? Because it's a known fact in Germany that the entire green movement was bought off and paid by Russia so that they can be dependent upon Russian natural gas and Russian oil. It's a known fact.
So when do you think we could see Saudi Arabia cut the U.S. off? And what do you think that'll do to oil prices?
I believe that we're already in the transition from deglobalization of the dollar. Correction. I see that we're already on the trend of de-dollarization even before 2022. It's just that the Biden administration and other key political individuals are accelerating that timeline. One of those factors is usually demographics, which if you want to show up the demographics of both Russia, China, US, India, and Japan, you can see all the effects of that, since it is highly important that people realize that demographics are the key backbone strength of your economy and your overall longevity as a great power.
Yeah,
Which
so what can you say about demographics? I actually have a few charts here from various countries that I can share, but let me get those up 1 second. Because I think you're definitely right about that. If you lose your, population, you're definitely going to see a lot of trouble. 1 second, I'm just trying to get that up. Do you see the chart?
I'm see your main browser on, like, your main splash page on Apple.
Shoot. Well, I don't know what's going on there, but would you like to talk a little bit about demographics, though?
Sure, because I think it'll be a lot more easier if I pull up this article from the Foreign Affairs, which drives home that point. And while I do that, do you want to pull up the image about fertility, like national fertility, and how important that is at the exact time, since that goes like hand in hand with what I'm talking about with historical fertility rates and this, since like this is a key point in like geopolitics and in demographics, since this influences again your size, like how much, like if you're a small nation like Japan, if you have a massive amount of demographics coming in, then it shows that you can extend have massive military age force like on the ready whenever you need to. Your capacities of your economy and what your entire like nation is tuned for. Since if you have a like if you have a if you have a pyramid where the old are like very small cohort and massive young population, that means that in the next like 20 or 40 years, you will have those people who are young that are getting to their like working age to then move to prime working age to where they create the most economic growth and capacity in the economy, so it can export like and like sell more to raise their overall living and standard of living to then retire, which is what happened during the 70s, where you had the baby boomers across the entire world replicate and like create and like there were massive cohort after World War II. And then that moved the entire trench, which led to the great moderation and the mass amount of wealth and creativity that we have. And now we have it to where since 2022 onwards, you had the medium amount of boomers across the entire world heading to retirement. And if you were to pull up those images, either in right now or in post production, you would see in the U.S. chart where you had like all of those kids being born based off those boomers. But you look at China or Russia, you see that that's not the case. They did not make those kids. And Japan is a highlight example of what happens if you never made those kids, because their demographic pyramid is like a massive collapse. And that's just the entire future to where they will have like for every retired person, you have 1 or 0.5 people supporting them. And in the US, this is the CBO, like which is the like Congressional Budget Office like report of how many people would be supporting like retirement age people in the next 20 years, like 2024, like 2040. You will have for every one retired age person, you have 2.3 young people supporting that person, which is insane. When if you think about when they people like when back when the boomers were heading to like working age like we are, like one old person would be supported by 10 to 20 boomers.
Wow.
So you can see the mass amount of wealth being sucked up through there unless we have a change across the entire world about the retirement age and everything, which is what you have in France with Macron trying to reform that. But I say that there's going to be a massive hit politically that's going to affect them, which affects the entire demographic pyramid, which affects the entire structure of Europe itself. Which
So that's gonna just make or break a country right there. It's just population. So we really see like India, they just surpassed China's population. So they're really like the rising superpower.
it's not about the population; it's about where that population demographic is located, because if you see in India, it's mostly in like the 30s and 40-year-olds, which is highly important because in China, they're already in their 50s and 60s,
Right.
which is a massive split. And thus it tells you China is already near its peak or about to peak, versus India, which is still increasing. Even with its massive population, it was still increasing economic growth and power, which is why demographics is so important.
I definitely agree. So you think in the United States we're heading into Japanese type demographic disaster?
No, because we have the millennials. Because millennials will be like, it will be close to offsetting, but it will not be enough. We will experience parts of Japan while at the same time dealing with a lack of confidence of the currency based on foreign entities, like which has the most amount of population, like India, Russia, China, in the Middle East. That's a massive cohort of people that is going to be saying, no, I do not want to have the dollar in trade. And thus, why you have the North-South corridor, which is a pipeline from Russia to like Iran, which is the first time they actually had railing and like pipelines going through each other to then take a seaborne route to India. And that is to cut out the like sea lane route where you had Russia going from the St. Petersburg down across the Nordic Sea, which is that goes to like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and all that stuff, all the way across the Mediterranean, which goes through Spain, like Italy, like Egypt, and all that stuff, to then go down to India, which means that you tighten up the BRICS nations to get in a much more cohesive network. So that if you were to have an outside force trying to influence them, then you need to have Turkey like allow them to go through it, which if you look at what's happening with Russia, Turkey, and Iran, creating a mutual defense pact and creating economic ties between all three of them. So you can settle up the Syrian war, which makes the US get out of Syria and puts pressure onto the Qatari like base that they have. Same with in Saudi Arabia. That means that you remove US's influence on the Middle East, while at the same time making cohesive and structured to where they join BRICS and supply most of the commodities to BRICS instead of Europe and the US when they need it the most.
Yeah. So do you think this will affect the United States people living in the US quite a bit, or mostly just the United States government?
Oh, both. It's all three. Because you need to really consider this fact. We produce food and everything else, right? But we don't produce the fertilizer. We don't have heavy manufacturing like textiles, like metal, like refining and all that stuff. All that has been exported to China and Russia. So if we really need to reindustrialize, that takes like 5 to 10 years at best, which means that you need to have time. But we don't have that time because you have one, the German like foreign like I think it's foreign secretary. Let me pull up the article. Yeah, Germany foreign minister saying that we are at war and we are fighting Russia. When she's talking about like sending tanks to them, here this is her quote at the EU. We are fighting a war against Russia and not against each other. Which she unwittingly said that Germany is now at a declaration of war against Russia without saying that she is.
Right.
Because it's an unofficial means of doing so. Because it was from an official like German branch. And you also have the Secretary of Defense of the US, Lloyd Austin, saying that we are now at a turning point of the war in Ukraine. Which is insane. Especially when you consider an earlier comment from Jens Stoltenberg, which is the NATO chief, saying that if NATO does not secede in Ukraine, this might be the end of NATO. Which is a really, really big statement from the head of NATO saying that. Which means the entire conception of US power and US power projection and US influence over Europe changes if Ukraine falls. Which is why you have many German like officials and U.S. military officials saying there is no other option besides having direct intervention or sending our troops in with our tanks to blunt Russia's force. Because remember, Russia's still putting in troops from its partial mobilization into
Yeah,
place.
and didn't Russia just conscript like 500,000 more men? Or I
Yeah,
think,
that's the partial militarization, which they have still yet to implement to battlefields.
are they going to get even more than that? That's just what I heard. It was 500,000.
Not yet.
Not yet.
They're putting into place exactly where they are, and they already are at the like done with few months of drilling, like try to keep them all up to like par to then put into defensionary garrisons, and for some to be in offensive measures to fill in the gaps.
That might be enough to overrun Ukraine since they already own quite a bit of it already with the
Again,
extra troops maybe.
yeah, and the thing is with the recent developments in the battlefront, where you have Solidar, which is a city town, which is above the Bakhmut, which is the main key city for the Zelensky line in the Donbass. And the reason why it's called the Zelensky line is because Zelensky personally came over there multiple times to support how important that city is. Even like NATO officials said how important that city was in the US as well. And now it is at risk of being encircled, which is why Zelensky and others are constantly sending more troops over there, even though they're having hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians die or have massive amount of casualties or injuries
Yeah.
a day. So it is massively important because if that line fails, they need to be pushed back to the Dnieper line, which is like sustaining most of like Western Ukraine over to the Russians, which will be a massive change of tune from what everyone in the Europe and the US has been experiencing and hearing so far.
So that's why
Which
the
again
United
goes
States.
into what Jens Stoltenberg said about like Ukraine and all that stuff. Like you see how it all cascades here.
So that's why the United States and other European powers are sending over so many tanks now for the first time. All these new weapons, right? Because of this, the conscripts finally going to be coming in, and that might turn the tide of battle.
But the thing is that Russia has already been prepared for this multiple months in advance by actually creating what is known as a, let me pull up the exact terminology since it can get a little bit complex here. Dragon teeth. Let me pull up since this was in the Guardian and
I believe Russia's population is actually stagnating right now as we speak, so they really need Ukraine to bolster their failing population.
yep, this was like in November. They were having dragon teeth, which dragon teeth is like concrete and other barricades, which prevents like tanks from moving through or armored vehicles. Like, and this is in Mariupol and other places. So yeah, right here from the UK defense, they were producing like concrete pyramid anti-tank structures, and this is months before the West had considered putting in like tanks into Ukraine. And this is on top of the fact that Russia has been recently been thinking about has been placing like anti-air missile systems in Moscow like 2 months ago. And now, even now, Zelensky's now talking about, hey, why don't you send like F-16s and other missiles over to Ukraine? And you're having that go up through the rounds of the military circles. So you see how Russia's being ahead of this, preparing for this in a World War II style. And yet the West are so used to being on the front foot that they are not able to catch up.
Yeah, so that'll make tanks not as effective and infantry more important in the war.
And
Once they
the thing is, these tanks come out multiple months from now when Russia is already making territorial gains now. So by the time it gets over there, there might not even be a Zelensky line for them Ukraine to defend, and that
so
you might have like multiple territories already being lost, which is
so
what they're being sent towards.
if Russia takes over Ukraine, what do you think their next step is, or do you think they're going to do anything after that, or?
I believe that if Ukraine does surrender on Russia's terms, you will have Russia allowing Poland and Hungary to take land from Ukraine and creating a rump state. while having Russia take parts of the West, like Western parts, especially Odessa, since this allows you to like absolve yourself of like the issues that you have, which I believe there's an like Poland talked about this. Let me pull it up. Right here. Yep. Where Poland condemns like the nationalistic leader Bandera in like western part of Ukraine. Let me, yep. This is from Poland. Like, yeah. So Bandera, which is tied to parts of the Ukrainian high command, where he was tied with the murder of Poles and Jews in World War II, and they're very well like located in eastern Ukraine, which is near Poland. That is why, again, a fascist and Nazi collaborator.
So
This is why.
So Ukraine's really just a German puppet state.
No, you could say that, but I'm saying that like Ukraine has influences from World War II time back in 1940s, and you're having Poland condemn it, and yet you don't see that in the news unless you look very closely. And if you are having to deal with that issue or trying to pacify that area, Eastern Ukraine, why don't you just concede that land and go to Poland, which really wants it, and Hungary that really wants it, and you create a rump state from the lands that all three states do not want to take. And now, like, ease off your issues of garrison and others to where you can be ready for offensive if NATO says, like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, that would definitely be a weird circumstance. And that would really do a lot of things to the United States. Is there any other thing that you're seeing happening in the economy right now that you like to talk about in the United States?
Again, I am really, really concerned about the corporate credit market, because if you look back in like 2020 and when Powell decided to like backstop the market, he especially did this one thing, which is that he backstopped every single triple B company bond. They're about to go into junk status so that you can have the US economy not go through another mass collapse by having pensions mass selling and other institutions just going bankrupt because they cannot receive their funding.
Right.
And that is what I'm really, really concerned about, since that liquidity prevention line, where it backs up most triple B bond markets by Powell just waving his magic wand and saying these are not immune from going to defunct status. That was written in congressional law, saying that he cannot do that again unless there's a new crisis. And that's what we're concerned of. What will be that new crisis for him to do so? And what will the White House do to make that crisis?
World War III.
That might be it. Or it might be a food like crisis or whatever crisis. Since that that backstopping of triple B bonds, which is like some like even some of the like companies that we know. Like think about like I can't say the name based on like the fact that it is like call in like putting in investment advice. I cannot do that. But most companies that you know or look into the strip mall, some of those companies could have gone bust if it wasn't for Powell waving his magic wand and backstopping their corporate bonds. That itself has to come to a head in late Q2 this year, unless we see a change from the Fed. And that is what is primarily concerning, since the banks will be constrained because the car loans that they have on their books are not able to deal with that. Like the banks are not able to deal with that on top of the credit lines that they gave to companies as well.
So
that's why I'm really concerned.
I guess the big question is, how are you preparing for all of these things that are going on, basically so people can replicate what you're doing to protect themselves?
The thing is, I have a lot of my net wealth in cash right now. And I also have it into parts of precious metal because For me, I see that as a long-term 20 or 30-year position because I don't care if gold goes to like $1,200. I don't care. I don't care if silver goes from 24, $25 an ounce to $10 an ounce. Because if those go down that much, what will the rest of the asset markets go down by? And by me like going down less in a deflationary or depressionary spiral, I win more because that wealth that mass gone down or will be offsetting the losses of people trying to withdraw on the assets that I have. And thus I use the cash that I have to buy assets that I want to buy when it's cheap. And if I am wrong, I do have the precious metal side so that I can like pick up with inflation since silver itself has much more of an industrial use. And since it's a lot more rare and you have massive supply deficits, you can you catch up that wind of inflation onto the metal itself, and those can trade it into assets that you want to get.
Yeah. So are you investing in any other commodities like food, like corn or copper or any other things?
Not at this current moment because it depends upon your counterparty, which I highly recommend that you look at your counterparty, you look at the company itself, look at where they are located, how they get their fertilizer, how they get all these sources, which needs to go into both the like company's balance sheet itself and like all the reports. And then sometimes you need to even call them because yes, you can call companies to as an investor to see what they do because that's part of like basic investment due diligence under the like the CFTC and FTC. So you can do that, and that's what I highly recommend. Since unless you do so, then you might be holding risk that you do not know about, which we discussed with the entire program here about like all the risks that is facing us in the long term, and yet most people just focus on the short term, like what happens in like a month from now, like we'll like BNBY, like Bed Bath Beyond, go to the moon. Like can we just like have like another like massive like 300% gains? Like this is not what we're in for. Like this is for the long term here, because we have the future ahead of us, and we can get advantage and plays because we have that time. Versus people who are boomers that might retire like 2 years from now, where they had to focus on the short term. And most money managers that are good in this market are that old.
That's definitely true. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the economy or any other thoughts that you have?
No, do you have any questions?
Well, I think you really covered everything pretty good. I think you definitely gave some solid advice how to protect yourself certain times that are coming up. And I really think it's important that people start preparing because I think, you're right. The Federal Reserve is probably going to be raising rates pretty soon, but good chance they'll start decreasing it after they raise it, and then that would cause inflation spiral. So definitely a lot of big things that are going on, and I definitely think you gave us a good insight on the things that are going on as well. And no, I don't really have any other questions.
Oh,
So
the thing is,
yes,
just to make sure that people in the audience are aware, what you want to buy is long-term 25-year like storage, which usually through like dry freezing, food supply. Because with how young we are, we will have food supply, and this will be going on for the next 5 to 10 years. So if you have like, even like $50 after every month, you need to buy food supply and not the cans, but you want to have long-term food supply because you're basically buying food now that you store so that you can like save on excess cash to where you can pay off your debts that you will get in the future when you are desperate, or can use that extra cash to get into like commodity stocks or like precious metals or whatever you need to, since you have the extra luxury of buying now at a cheaper price for a lot longer time duration than people are expecting or planning for. And that is very crucial, since how many people here looked at the like USDA food crop report? Who here looks about the like entire like BSSF and fertilizer? Like who even like looks at that stuff around our age, besides me and several other people? Like that gives you the edge from everyone else who does not watch this, because that allows you to be ahead and prepare yourself so that when people ask you about like how are you to buy so much, it's because you looked ahead and you planned ahead instead of just going by the whim and just realizing, oh, my credit card is like maxed out and I need to eat or need to pay rent. But if you buy your food ahead of time when it's cheaper, you can pay rent and you still have food because you saved ahead of time and you planned ahead of time.
That's definitely true. It's good for people to actually prepare for coming disasters because if you're caught with your shirt off, then you're in a bad scenario. So, and you're definitely right too. You can just look at rice prices. That's a non-perishable food or pretty non-perishable, and they go up like way up, every few weeks. So it's definitely a good way to store your wealth is in food because it's definitely not going down like you said.
And the thing is, most food prices are actually creating a new base. Same with metals. And unless we have massive deflationary collapse, which could happen like in late Q1, like in late Q2, where you have the trend line we break based on like the like mass scramble for dollars. It will still eventually go back up because of the fact that people need to eat. And yet the supply of food in the world is decreasing because of fertilizer. And we don't have the modern infrastructure to make more fertilizer without taking years. And that's
uh,
why.
I agree. Would have to get it from a different country for sure. Um, and I would just like to say thanks for coming on the show again. I think you gave really good insight on everything that's going on. Really appreciate you coming on the show. And I would just like to thank all the viewers who are watching the show. And if you have any questions for me or Alex, be free to write it in the comments section and we'll get back to you. And thanks to everyone who watched the video. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day. God bless.
Yep. Thank you again.
Thank you.